Welcome back to today's episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief O'Brien from Seymour PD. He has 30 years total in law enforcement, and he is also a graduate of the FBI National Academy. Welcome to the show, Chief O'Brien. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paige, for having me.
Of course. Give us a little bit of background. So, 30 years total in law enforcement.
Yeah.
What was your life like before law enforcement, and what has your career looked like so far?
So, I was born to high school students. So my parents got married in high school, and that marriage didn't last. Um, so when I was 5, my mother had remarried, and I was adopted by my stepdad, who really became my father growing up. Uh, he grew up the old school way. It was hard knocks, learning your lessons. We moved from Cincinnati to Indiana, which was at the time it was kind of the rural area of the suburbs. Now it's the suburbs where I grew up. Um, had a typical childhood. You know, my parents then started a new family later in life. Well, I call it later in life. I was 10 when my sister came along, and then 12 when my little brother came along. So, um, I started to think of my biological father, why he would allow me to be adopted and stuff. And I know I struggled with that for a couple of years, and then graduated high school, had no clue what I wanted to do. If you look behind me, I'm the fourth generation of police officers. Um, my great grandfather was a police officer. My grandfather, that I lived with after my parents divorced, was a Cincinnati police officer. And I remember him coming home in uniform, and that was kind of what I wanted to do with my career. And I had found out later that my biological father was a Cincinnati police officer also. And I just always wanted to be a police officer. I joined the army to get college money so I could go to college. At the time, there was a big push to have 60 credit hours to get hired at a police department. So I didn't have the financial resources, so I decided to join the army. Got out, went to college, got out of college, and basically drove across the state and applied every police department around and got hired in Seymour,
Wow.
and started my journey here.
Thank you for sharing that. And I don't think that you know this, but I was also raised by my single stepdad.
Yeah.
My parents were both drug addicts, and my dad was incarcerated, and so, he had his life and choices that he made. And then my mom decided she didn't want to be a mom anymore and kind of dropped me off one day at my stepdad's, who was my ex-stepdad at the time. They were divorced, and was like, I don't want to be a mom. Here you go. And he raised me as a single dad. And so I can relate to that struggle of, and obviously we probably have different experiences and, obviously different ways of coping with things. But for me, I had a lot of self-worth challenges of wondering, why I wasn't good enough to be,
I
kept. And
I
that was
I
hard.
had I had those too, and I was with my biological mother, and I had a father who, he did things with me, played ball with me,
Mhm.
bought me a motorcycle. I mean, we grew up outside of town, so we had a little bit of acreage to ride a motorcycle on, and I mean, he treated me like his own child. There was never. I knew I was adopted. I mean, my mother never. She just said we were just too young. We were just too young to be involved. And I always wondered, especially when you get to those teenage years, I felt like at the time I felt slighted a little bit, and it's more me than what truly happened, because here I am at 12 years old, and I have a newborn as a sibling. And so by the time I was 16, my little brother's 4 years old, and
Yeah.
they require a lot more attention than a 16-year-old does. So I felt like I was getting abandoned a little bit, which I already had that stigma before. So I do think that it affected me a little bit, but I overcame that. And I will tell you that when I was in the Army, I did receive a letter from my biological father. Part of the deal was when I was adopted, he wasn't allowed to make contact till I was 18. So he probably got my birthday wrong because I didn't receive it until I was 19. So,
Mm.
but I did get a letter from him, and I did meet him. And then over the years, he would talk to my grandfather, and he knew that I worked here at Seymour, so he would call. I'd be working night shift, and he would call intoxicated, want to talk, and like he always said he was going to come visit, and he never did. And then when I was 49 years old, which was about 5 years ago, he reached out to me, and I said, you know what, I'm going to him. So I picked him up and took him out to lunch. And from that day until he died, he had cancer, and I think he wanted to make amends.
Yeah.
And it was, I sat there. I wasn't a part of his life. He wasn't a part of mine, but we reconnected. And for the next 4 years, he texted me every day or called me every day. And so I feel like I made amends with that part of my life. So,
Yeah, I definitely think that the things that we go through shape us in a lot of different
yeah,
ways, and it gives us different perspectives that we can utilize, as we get older and as we progress in our lives, both professionally and personally. And I had those same feelings, and my dad actually ended up having a baby 2 years ago. So I have a 2 year
yeah,
old sister. And
yeah,
even now, I've done so much work in understanding that their decisions were not a reflection of me or my self-worth, that it
right,
was their choices. There was a lot of wellness and, healing that had to go through that. Even 2 years ago, that was hard for me too, to see my dad raising a newborn when he
yeah,
wasn't there for me. And so, I think that it's a process for sure.
yeah, yeah,
But for us to have the ability to overcome it, but then also to have a sense of understanding and empathy for people who are going through hard things or similar things,
yeah,
I think is a superpower. And I don't know if you've ever felt that because you've gone through some of those things, that now you can relate to the people in the community in which you serve better and you can
yeah,
show up for other people better, because I feel like it's a tool in your toolbox that, maybe not everybody has. So to me, it's a superpower.
yeah. I would agree with that, that you do approach things differently, that, like somebody's having a bad day. We've all had bad days. And, I look back at my career, I'm winding down at this point. I've got about a year and a half left, and I sit there and go, I look at the calls that I've gone on, and I can understand and have empathy for those people that, I, I always had a roof over my head. We were probably the working poor, like I always had a roof and food on the table. But, like growing up, you learn so much from your parents. And, I'm a workaholic, and that's because my parents were, like they had 3 kids to raise, and they struggled to, provide for all of us. But we always had a roof. We always had love in the family. I didn't go without, um, my mom will tell you, I would argue with her that, I didn't always have the nicest clothes, like like when this fad was going on or that fad, I never got those until a couple of years later when they were on the clearance rack,
Mm.
so, but it makes you look at things differently nowadays. And it's funny because my wife yells at me all the time. Like I'll get a name brand shirt and I won't get rid of it for 10 years. And it's like, I gotta wear it out. Like I never had that kind of stuff growing up. So, but it does it, like I relate to a lot of people that we deal with on a daily basis, and I feel like I've made a difference in somebody's life somewhere down the road.
Yeah. And, I think that when you're in those environments, you are almost forced to look for the good things too.
Yeah,
Um, because what's the other option? We can
yeah,
continue to go down the path of like, this is hard, everything is bad, which a lot of people do that. But when you were saying, hey, I had a roof over my head, I had food on the table, there was love, to me, it's like you're seeing the things to be grateful for.
yeah,
And I've always tried to do that too, of like, yeah, like I had a hard upbringing, but I had someone who loved me and who wanted the best life for me and tried their best to provide for me. And, maybe I didn't have the nurturing mom side of things, because I was raised by an engineer that
yeah.
was like,
Sorry for
and
you.
that worked a lot, and so, but I think you have to train your brain to look for the good stuff,
Yeah,
especially in the hard times. And I think that that plays a lot into, what we talk about even in law enforcement wellness is, you guys are going to go through a lot of hard things. You're going to see a lot of hard things. You're going to
yeah,
have a lot of stressful calls, be in stressful environments. And how can we find the positive? How can we find the gratitude and counteract some of that stuff? And for
yeah,
me, a lot of times that mindset was the only thing that got me through some of the hard times of being like, well, at least I have this,
yeah,
or at least I can be grateful for that. And so I think that it's important for us to have that. And it sounds like that's how you were able to overcome some of those things too.
yeah. And growing up, I moved in the middle of kindergarten from Cincinnati to Lawrenceburg, Indiana. So I moved to this small little town, and the my first friend is still my friend today. Like we still call each other. I can like if I'm having a bad day, I can call him and he will literally pick up the phone today. And my next door neighbor, growing up, even though he was probably a quarter mile away, you know, he drove through town the other day as a salesperson for a company, and they do business here in town. He always calls me, and so I have deep friendships that I think because I didn't feel like I had, like I don't know, I didn't want to be abandoned again. So I have friendships that have been lifelong friendships,
Yeah.
and I cherish those, and I look back and I go, we had some of the greatest times, and I still do. I go out and hang out. My best friend, I was over at his house one day, and he said his kids couldn't have dessert. Um, and I wanted some ice cream. There's in Cincinnati, there's a great ice cream joint, and I door dashed it to the house. I didn't tell him, and I got his kids out front. I said, "Hey, grab a spoon. We're gonna go dig night crawlers." And so we went outside, and we ended up. The DoorDash guy arrived, and I go, "Huh? Look at there, ice cream arrived." But I mean, those friendships I've had forever, and it has, it makes me. I don't always look at people the negative way. I think I look at the positives in people, and I feel like that has helped me in my entire career here.
Yeah. And, I've had people ask me this. They're like, with all the podcasts you've done, like, what are like some of the, core objectives or, the top things that people say? And I think we talk about this a lot of, how can you nurture life outside of your job? And
Mm-hmm.
how can you choose your circle really closely?
Yeah,
Because that matters. And, the saying, show me who your friends are and I'll show you your future.
yeah,
And so it's this idea of, my mom didn't teach me a lot because she wasn't around, but she did tell me that, like, you are who your friends are, and how can you choose wisely to have a really good network of people who want you to succeed, who are making good decisions, who are going to be sources of inspiration and motivation for you, and not people
yeah,
who are going to, drag you down or are choosing the wrong paths. And so
yeah.
that always stuck with me. And so that is something that I find to be really important too, is how can we make sure our circle are like top-notch, high quality?
Well, and it's funny because I hung around with people in school that probably didn't do the greatest things all the time, and but I always had this belief that I was going to be a police officer, So I didn't do those kind of things. And
Mm.
it's funny because as I got into this career, some of the guys that I hung around with in school are state troopers, ATF agents, like it's funny because I look back and I go, our table at lunchroom was five cops, like out of six guys, five of us are cops, and
Yeah.
it's amazing to me that, I did, and we got into mischief. I'll say that mischief. It wasn't criminal, it was mischief, some of the things that we did. But they had the same values that I did, I think, and that was the route that they wanted to go to, maybe in the law enforcement. So, I was able to stay away from drugs and alcohol during school, and when I got in the army, it was this is my goal. I just got to get through this so I can go to college. So, uh, yeah, I tried to stay on the straight and narrow, to do everything right because this is what I wanted to do with my life.
Yeah. And you did it. So
Yeah,
30 years,
yeah.
third generation,
Fourth.
fourth
I'm the fourth.
generation.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, can you talk a little bit, because I know, you and I talked offline a little bit about this, but how has this career impacted you and your wellness specifically?
So, you know, I, I got a great support network at home. I met my wife. She was a paramedic here in Seymour, and I met her on a shooting call one day. Um, and I found out later she was the chief's daughter, and I was like, "Oh, great, here we go." And I remember the day I went in and talked to the chief and said, "Hey, you got a problem with me dating your daughter?" And he, basically told me if I break her heart, he was ripping mine out. But uh, we're still together 29 years later. And I've got a good support network at home. Uh, I've tried not to bring the job home, but I do talk about it. And my wife, she's moved on from being a paramedic, but she saw those kind of things that we have to see every day. Um, and I don't want to say it's a small community, but we're 22,000. We have 48 police officers here, and you see everything. I've worked everything from a minor car wreck to a murder. Like you see everything. It may not happen as routinely as it does in larger populations, but it still happens. Um, you try not to bring it home. You compartmentalize that area and kind of like try to do what you think is right. Um, I don't think that I have experienced PTSD over my career. Um, Back in 1997, it was my first fatal accident. I got called um, on April 5th, 1997. I got called to a fatal accident down on the south side of town. Um, didn't really bother me. It was an 18-month-old child had been run over in the driveway. It didn't bother me that day. I had to go to, small community back then. There was only 28 of us. So you were the investigator. You did it all. So I remember going to the morgue, first autopsy I'd ever been to. I had to do all of it. And it wasn't until like 5 years later, my daughter is born, and I was getting her dressed one day, and I just remember the little girl that had been run over. She had an Oshkosh by gosh button from her coveralls stuck to her skin, and as I was buttoning up my daughter, um, I noticed that button. It was the same kind of button, and it didn't. I didn't think it affected me. I just took that outfit off of her and put something else on her, but I started to, I don't know, I didn't sleep for days. I was struggling. I was at wit's end with my wife. It was affecting my life, and that was not me. And I actually reached out to my father-in-law, who was retired at the time, and he says, "Hey, when I was chief, we hired this company we got credits, and you can go see a counselor. So I was like, okay. So I grabbed the card, I call them, and I scheduled an appointment. I didn't tell my wife. I just, on my day off, I went up there and I scheduled an appointment and started talking about things. And uh, they told me I had PTSD. And so for the next couple weeks, it was, I didn't want to tell anybody. And back then, the chief would just get a thing that somebody went and got a credit, like a credit was used. And so I didn't want to tell anybody. My wife kept asking me, "Where are you going?" I was like, I got stuff to do at work or whatever. Finally, after about 2 or 3 weeks, I finally told her that's where I was going, and I ended up. I think we went to a group counseling session together, and I got over it. And from then on, I learned how to do the things that I needed to do in life. Um, I live one day at a time. If I can tell the young guys out there, is don't hold it back from your spouse. I think, I look back now, and my wife is my best friend. She really is. We do all kinds of stuff together. Like, she makes fun of me because I watch stupid stuff on TV
Mhm.
or whatever, and I make fun of her for watching stupid stuff on TV. But at the end of the day, we're really good friends. And I look back now, and I should have been telling her what I felt, what emotions were going through me. And I think it's funny. I look back at some of the guys that I really like around here at the PD, and they're the guys that are on their first marriage, like I am. It's like we kind of probably talk to our wives more. And I think when I first started, it was like, yeah, I'm not going to tell her anything. But now I tell her what's going on. And I think that's one of the biggest things is you have to communicate with what goes on, because we see the worst of the worst every day. And for 15 years, I was a detective here and a crime scene tech. So I was the one that went to all these dead bodies, to suicides, to murders, to murder suicides, fatal accidents, like I was the one that had to do that kind of stuff. And, I went home and told my wife, this is what I saw. And this is, and I think that helped me through my career. And, like, if anything for the young guys, it is find that person you like and you like to hang out with them, and tell them exactly what goes on in your life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. I appreciate you having the courage to be vulnerable and share some of the things that you've been through. And I I think that a lot of people can relate to not wanting to share stuff,
Yeah,
wanting to like hide it, not wanting people to know the messy parts, not wanting people to know that we're struggling. I think that in a lot of ways, and especially back in 1997, I'd imagine there's a lot of stigma that goes
yeah,
along with it. I do think that things are starting to evolve and change where it's now more part of the conversation, but um, I have come to the realization that there's so much strength and power in us sharing our experiences
yeah,
and people understanding that they're not alone, like that every experience is going to be a little bit different, right? Every experience is going to be unique. The way that we handle them or, you know, the way that we see the world is going to be different, because we're all different human beings. But for us to be able to have this conversation right now and be like, yeah, this impacted me,
yeah,
and here's why, and here's what happened, and here's what I did. I think that that is what we need to continue breaking that stigma so that
yeah.
people feel more comfortable sharing their stories.
Well, and I think you talk about, explaining your stuff. So it's funny. A normal person would come into the squad room, and we have a big oval table in the middle of the squad room,
Mhm.
and it's usually the lunch table or whatever. But the stories that are told around it, from the old guys to the new guys, and I think that helps the new guys a lot. It may not be the same, but it's very similar. I look back and I go, some of the stories that you tell, and people go, that ain't true. And I go, if there was body cams back then, you would be laughing so hard. Like, it's I mean, the things that are said to police officers are what you see every day. And it does help. Like I said, if you would be offended, some people would be offended to listen to what is talked at around the round table in the back, like, but it is a way for officers to debrief and to get it out.
Yeah,
And I've worked with some great chiefs over the year. I don't know if you know who Dr. Gil Martin is,
I do.
but Dr. Gil Martin was brought in by one of our chiefs to talk to the officers, and the humor that the guy has, bashing on policemen, bashing on firemen. It was just awesome to listen to, his stories. But he made a lot of sense in that back in the, and I'm not saying that there wasn't PTSD back in the 60s and 70s, but back then a lot of officers were two-man cars. And so you had your partner you could bounce stuff off of. And, by the time I got hired in the 90s, we were single man units. And
Hmm.
he said, firemen see the same thing that policemen see every day, but they don't have as much, not that they don't have it, but they don't have as much PTSD. But that's because they arrive at the scene together and they go home together. You
Right.
know, the SWAT team's the same way. They may see the worst of the worst, but then they come back in the truck together and they're, cutting up. And an officer leaves and then he's, in his own world and nobody to talk to. So, after an incident that we have here, we started to do the debriefings like right away. Like if they call me up at 2 o'clock in the morning because we just had something, I'll come in. Like I live like 2 miles away from the station, and so they know that they can call me 24 hours a day. It's not uncommon for me to get a call in the middle of the night, and it's funny. I'll answer the phone. They'll go, "Were you awake?" And I don't know if it's just the way I am, but when I hear the phone, it's like I'm chirpy and ready to go, And it's probably the 15 years of being a detective, that I had to be ready to go when I was on call. And so we do those debriefs like immediately, like we sit down and do those debriefs of those stressful situations. Because if you let it fester for a couple days, you start getting that mentality of what did I do right? What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong?
Yeah.
Where a lot of times you didn't do anything wrong. It's just, it is what it is. Life goes on, and, but you got to get there quickly and they have to know that you do care about them, like, um, I try to understand their lives and ask them how their families are and stuff like that. One thing I do every morning when I walk in is I greet them, by first name. I come through and whoever's working, I always greet them by their first name. Make my round through dispatch, and like I try to make it as a family unit around this department.
Yeah.
And I think that they do trust me. And with that trust comes a lot of things that I hear because people will come into my office because I have an open door and I do learn a lot about them, and some of them will come to me and say, "Hey, got an issue. Well, let's get it addressed," and we'll get into this, but I feel like I'm in a desert in Seymour, Indiana. We're an hour south of Indianapolis, an hour north of Louisville. Depending on how you look at it, we're about 60 miles, but depending on traffic, it might be an hour and a half to Cincinnati, Ohio. And so we're a rural community, but I call us the little bit bigger town in the area. And so we don't have the resources that a big city does. So when I needed help back in 2001, I had to drive to Indianapolis for those meetings, and at some point, I don't know when, but that company, closed or whatever, and we had no resources in this area, and I struggled for about 6 years. Well, I'll say 5 years to find something really that we could do. Now I had reached out to the hospital, and they have a psychiatrist there who's brother-in-law was a trooper, so he understood. So we could send people to him if we had a officer involved shooting or something like that. But when they needed just everyday mental health checkup, I didn't have anybody. And so it took me almost 3 years to work out a deal. And prior to that, I had a folder in my desk and I would put Paige Arnold's name in it and put her as officer number two or officer. And I would tell them, you go and get your counseling and have it billed as officer number two. Well, I knew who it was, and I didn't think that was right. Nobody paying the bills knew who it was. I just had a folder with, each of the officers, and I just scrambled up their numbers. And, I'd say, hey, just tell me you're officer number 3 or 4 or whatever. And they would send the bill, and I'd be like, pay it. And they would be like, who's it for? It doesn't matter. It's officer 3,
Yeah.
and we had to break that. And so one of the hardest things was to the administration of a hospital. They need a patient's name. And I'm like, I don't want to give you a name. You guys can do what you want, but I just want to be billed. I just want to pay you. And you just take a credit out when they go for treatment. And that took us a while to do. And then my assistant chief actually went and sat down with the counselor just to see how it would work. And I got a bill for an unknown officer, like they just took it out. So how many people use it? I don't know. I don't. I know that the money, as I put money into it, it comes out. They give me a statement and say that I used $500 this month. I don't know who it is, and I think that's the best way to do it. And I struggled though in a small town to find somebody willing to do that.
Yeah.
And it's not fair to the officers that they don't have somebody professionally that they can go and get help for.
Yeah. There's a couple things I want to circle back to that I thought were really interesting. So, the first thing you were talking about, Dr. Gilmartin, and
Yeah.
this idea of moving from a two-man to a one-man vehicle and what that
Mhm.
does. And as you were talking, I was thinking about this. And what is one of the worst punishments that we give people? It's isolation, right?
Correct.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, if you did something real bad, like you're thrown in there by yourself,
Yeah.
isolation, right? We know that that's one of the worst punishments. And so it was interesting to hear you talk because I'm like, yeah, I've always said I think that conversations can save lives. But I
Yeah.
think after this conversation, I'm going to add to that conversations, community, and connection save lives. And
Yeah.
if we and I think by nature when we go through hard things we tend to isolate ourselves too.
We do.
And so how can we create a network and an environment that is conducive to talking about it, to having people in your corner who are willing to be that community and to have those connection points with people. And so thank you for putting that into like a different perspective for me because I've never thought of that of like, wow, what is the worst thing that we can do is isolate ourselves or
Yeah.
isolate each other. And then how do we create an environment that doesn't do that, that creates a safe space for conversation and community and connection.
And, and that's the hardest thing because as a police officer, you're in that one man car, and so you got to get them back here to the station and, kind of debrief that. That's why I say, and I've got some really good supervisors that, I mean, that's what they do. They've taken it and run with it and, or they go out and jump in the car with them, if after they've had a bad run and that, there is something to having a 2-man unit, like I think that really helps. But in today's society, we can't do that. We're a mobile police force and we cover a larger area where before, I listened to my grandfather talk. He walked the beat. He literally walked a 4 square block beat, you know, and he knew everybody in his neighborhood, like that was his neighborhood. He knew everybody. And, and we got away from that. That was the community policing of the 50s, in the 60s. We put everybody in a car with windows up, so we got away from community policing. but we also alienated our officers. And, one of the big things is you have to communicate. I can't stress that enough to young guys all the time. You have got to communicate. If something's bothering you, you got to talk about it. And we do see the worst of the worst. You
Yeah.
know, I've had officers that, you know, uh, I made a mistake one night. We had an officer involved shooting, and I rushed here to the station and I got some new firearms for them. Went upstairs and got new firearms for them, so they didn't feel like they were going home empty-handed. Right? Like it wasn't your fault. This is, I should have taken them to the scene. I had them here at the station and they felt naked going from the scene back to the station. And I gave them their loaded guns and said, here you go, and they put them back in their holster, and the other guns were evidence, right? So, but I learned a hard thing because they felt alienated, like I did something wrong. So,
Right.
I now, in the back of my mind, I will, if that ever happens again, I will take the guns to the scene because they felt like once we took them away from them for evidence, that they felt alienated, like they had done something wrong. And that's not what I wanted to construe to, you
Yeah.
know? And so you learn from past mistakes. There's a lot of things that I've learned, you try something and then, yeah, that didn't work, and, but I always feel like I should give somebody the benefit of the doubt, like, uh, for rank, I had people tell me, well, I don't know about this guy, and I go, well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. And it didn't work out, or maybe it did, but I feel like I give the benefit of the doubt to people. And I think that's, from my upbringing and everything else that, I try to see the best in people, and, they may have had a good point at one point. And so I want to give them, maybe they'll go off the charts and do great things, or maybe they were right,
I had someone say, assume positive intent
Yeah.
always. And I think that's a piece of giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's like, did they mean to do certain things? Was it intentional? Was their intent to do that? Yes or no? And
Yeah.
I think that when you have that environment, it also helps with the trust and the safety and, people feeling like it's okay to make mistakes sometimes, and I had someone say this. They said mistakes are not misconduct. Like there's a difference between making a mistake and misconduct. But
Yeah.
they said, everyone's going to make mistakes. And so when you give people the benefit of the doubt and you try to learn from those things and you try to create a welcoming environment, I think that that also helps with everything that we've talked about. I think that helps with wellness, helps with
Yeah.
breaking the stigma.
Yeah.
People feel like they can exhale a little
Yeah.
bit, and I think that that's really important. But, we were laughing before we hit record that we feel like we can talk for 2, 3 hours, which I
Yeah.
think is probably true.
Yeah.
But we are butting up at, towards the end of our conversation today. And you mentioned just a few moments ago, the younger officers that are coming in, the younger men and women who are entering into this profession. What words of wisdom? I know you've shared some that already, but what words
So
of wisdom would you share with
I,
them?
so I think one of the greatest things that an old timer told me one time was treat people how you would want your mother to be treated. Uh, and I've taken that to heart. I look at my career and I go, there have been many times when we have dealt with people over the years who would fight every officer they ever had. They never fought with me. And
Mm.
I think it's because I treated them like a human being. And, my words to the young is just treat everybody like you would want your mother to be treated. It was funny that, so they used to, back in the day, they used to scoop the loop downtown, 4 block by block wide, scoop the loop. Everybody would come down and crank their stereo and scoop the loop. And I wrote a lot of warnings. Like I think I got my message across by writing warnings. And one night I had stopped the guy for the same infraction twice, and I wrote him a ticket. I thought it was funny because he was downtown griping to his friends, and they go, "Oh, Brian wrote you a ticket? Well, then you messed up."
Mhm.
because I tried to treat people like I was treated when I was younger, and growing up without, I don't want to say a lot of money, but I never could afford a ticket. I would have, like I would have had to done something to afford to pay for a ticket. So I've always said that if you treat people right, it'll come back to you. And I think that that's what's happened in my career. And if I tell young guys, it's treat people like you would want your mother treated, and when you do that, it will come back around, especially when you least expect it. You may go to a domestic and that person goes, "Oh, it's O'Brien. He treated me fairly, he was nice to me, let me go." And they don't fight with you, like, and there are people that just want to fight the police, but as long as you treat them like a human being and treat them like you'd treat your mother, then things will work out great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you
Yeah.
coming on here and talking to me for a little bit about wellness and leadership. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, Paige. Thank you.
Of course.